want to make sure you get your full recording. Awesome. So, and do it again. All right, so you guys are in ballroom C. Hopefully, that's where you want to be. This is the anything track. So again, hopefully that's where you want it to be. If not, I'm sure you can figure out how to get out of here. Until we lock the doors, and then you're stuck here for life. Just a couple housekeeping things. I don't think we're having issues with it. Please don't block the doors. Cell phones, you know the drill. Silence, off, whatever. I'm wearing boots today for that purpose. Don't make me have to use them. Other than that, we are talking quantitative analysis. And with that, I will turn it over to Aamil.
Awesome. Thanks, everybody. I appreciate it. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on what time zone your brains are on right now. I know we've all been traveling. I appreciate you guys coming in during the matinee show of 12 o'clock. I know it's lunchtime, so I appreciate you guys spending the next 20-25 minutes as we discuss relevance, timeliness, and the role of qualitative intelligence analysis in your information security intelligence function. So just a couple talking points we'll have for today. We'll be focusing on relevance and timeliness. Can you guys still hear okay? Okay. Focus on relevance and timeliness, understanding why that's important when you're doing analysis, understanding what qualitative analysis is. It goes beyond just looking at technical aspects and reverse engineering malware. And then also we'll try to tackle how we can visualize and measure something as subjective as qualitative analysis. In the program brochure, you guys saw that my name was typed out as Aamil, AK. My last name is Kermi, but there is a different reason why I go by AK. Prior to joining the information security industry, I served in the U.S. Army as an all-source intelligence analyst, a 96B. I spent 6 years in Afghanistan working for the U.S. Army, working for Air Force OSI, which is the equivalent of the NCIS for the Navy, if you guys are familiar with that. And then I also had a pretty decent stint with U.S. SOCOM, kind of doing their human intelligence analysis. So when you spend 6 years in Afghanistan, you go a little native, and that's a picture of me back in 2011, getting really into what I was doing out there. It was really fun. So we'll start with focusing on relevance and timeliness. So how do we define relevance and timeliness? Those are the two key priorities that I've kind of focused on in my career, 13 years doing intelligence analysis. And we focus on relevance and timeliness. So how do I define what relevance is? Basically, does it meet our collection requirements? Is the threat valid? Are the sources that you're getting your information from reliable? Is it impacting your area of operations? Your area of operations being whether you're supporting an enterprise or whether you're a service provider or a vendor and your customers are considered your area of operation. And is there anything you can do about it, which is probably one of the most important things. And timeliness is pretty straightforward. How long ago or how recent was the event or the adversary's activity, and how quickly were you able to disseminate that information? So, and one of the things when it comes to identifying reliable sources and deciding what you can do about a particular threat, we're constantly bombarded with a lot of information, whether it's in information security or whether we were out in the field. There's new information, new intelligence coming at us every single day, every single second. And it's hard to kind of weed through all that information and identify what information meets your criteria for relevance. And a lot of these things, some of these things that you guys see up on the page here, you might remember from last year where we had Bloomberg put out their super micro report about Chinese having devices or implants in, major technology products. I listed as a controversy in this slide. It actually really turned into just a big clusterfuck because it was completely irrelevant information. Skyfall and Solace CPU vulnerability hoax. It was more of a social experiment. So a couple years ago, when we had the Spectre and Meltdown vulnerabilities come out, there was a researcher that actually put together a fake website just a couple weeks after Spectre and Meltdown was announced. And because there was so much hysteria around Meltdown and Spectre, he created these fake vulnerabilities called Skyfall and Solace. And for the next 48, 72 hours, the industry just lost their shit. I mean, people were going all over the place talking about Skyfall and CPU vulnerabilities and this and that. And he eventually came out and said, look, this was all fake. It was a social experiment to show how quickly people respond to the latest and greatest news sound bites. And that's really not the way that information security and intelligence functions should operate, because it takes a lot of resources and time away from what's actually relevant and what actually needs to be put out in a timely fashion. So how do we determine what's relevant? Well, you establish your area of operations, right? Your area of operations is easily identified by what your SLAs are, your service level agreements, who you're supporting, whether it's the enterprise, whether it's your customers that you're supporting. And the best place to start and kind of establish your area of operations is pretty much the event logs, right? If you're supporting your customers, what's going on in their environments? If you're on part of an internal security team, what's going on in your organization's environments? So what we're going to do is walk through a couple of data collection points that we collected over the first half of 2019, and we'll see if we can use that information that we got from the logs to prioritize our collection requirements, prioritize our intelligence collection, and see if we can apply some qualitative analysis to come up with the best event-driven risk recommendation that we can provide our customers. So we took the overall data from the first 6 months of this year, and we saw that 35% of the events were related to really old commodity malware and really old vulnerabilities. And we broke that down to show you exactly what we were seeing. So we have the usual suspects. We had TrickBot, we had Emotet show up, but we're still seeing NJ-RAT, we're still seeing HWorm, which are pretty much cousins. You can see we have vulnerabilities from 2017 and prior that are coming up. So looking at this information, we came up with the assessment that, hey, old commodity malware and old vulnerabilities, and by old I mean at least 24 months, are still relevant threats, and they're still threats that our customers need to address before they can move on to the next sexy thing that comes out tomorrow. So we broke down the vulnerabilities even further, and as you can see, the top 10 vulnerabilities that we saw across our customer environments that were constantly being exploited, a majority of them are actually going back to 2017 and prior, and the number one on the list was a combination of all the what we call the eternal vulnerabilities, basically the SMB vulnerabilities, 2017, 0144, 0143, 0145. So we kind of grouped them into one because they would have taken up probably the first 5 spots on the list. So having this information that we got from customer environments, we came up with the assessment that, hey, old vulnerabilities and old malware are still relevant threats. These still need to be addressed before we move on to the next big thing that comes out. Can we corroborate this information? Is anybody else seeing this? Is this a trend that's going on elsewhere? Well, it turns out that Recorded Future puts out a list every year of the top 10 most commonly observed CVEs that are being exploited by cyber criminals based off advertisements that are on the dark web forums. You know, the malware's listed, here's what they exploit. And according to their report from 2018, 7 out of the 10 vulnerabilities were actually from 2017 and earlier. So that's one source that we were able to corroborate our own information with. And from the 10 that Recorded Future identified, 3 of those were actually on our list too. Number 11 on our list was also on part of their top 10, but we only stuck with the top 10. We took it a step further. We actually said, okay, we have researchers that are saying old vulnerabilities are common. What are the actual adversaries saying? What are they actually doing? So we dug further and we identified that even adversaries on these dark web forums are advertising exploit kits, malware, exploit code that still continues to exploit really old vulnerabilities. So now we have another set of information that corroborates our initial assessment. So if you guys can't see this very clearly, what you have on the left side is a post that was taken from a rather reliable, well-known Russian malware forum. And basically they're advertising a new refreshed exploit code for Dirty Cow, which goes back to 2016. And that posting was put up back in February of just this year. So they're still talking about exploiting vulnerabilities that are 3 years old, and probably because they know it still works. And on the right side, we have a Chinese language actor that's posting or leasing Rig exploit kit and advertising all the vulnerabilities that their version of Rig is capable of exploiting. You can see that the earliest or the latest vulnerability is 2018, and it goes all the way back to vulnerabilities from 2013. So what we did was we took event-driven data from our area of operations, which was our customer environments. We were able to prioritize our collection. We were able to prioritize our intelligence requirements. We corroborated that with reliable sources, and we were able to come up and confirm our initial assessment that old-ass vulnerabilities and commodity malware are still relevant threats that need to be addressed by our customers before we move on to identifying what the next latest and greatest threat is. So I've thrown the term qualitative analysis around a couple times already. So what do I mean by qualitative analysis? What does that constitute to me? So to me, qualitative analysis focuses on two things, impact and probability, right? How likely is an adversary going to act on whatever they say they're going to act? How likely are they going to attack you? And how bad is it going to hurt if they do come after you? Now, because qualitative analysis is essentially subjective based, there's a lot of subjective attributes, subjective qualities that go with qualitative analysis. It's difficult to put a hard figure or a hard number or a measurement on something as qualitative analysis, I guess. So that's the difficulty. How do we visualize, how do we measure an adversary's risk based off these attributes that we're collecting? And even Sherman Kent, who we call the father of modern intelligence analysis, this was something that even he struggled with. So it's still an endeavor that intelligence analysts like me that don't really focus on technical aspects are working towards trying to identify how we can identify and measure risk just based off looking at adversary activity and not so much the malware and the tools that they use. And one type of qualitative intelligence comes in the form of human intelligence, pretty much my bread and butter, what I did before I joined this industry. Human intelligence, or HUMINT, is basically any information that was collected from human sources. And what human intelligence strives to do is it tries to identify the actual behavior and the driving forces of the adversary versus looking at what a piece of malware that they're using is doing over the wire. And looking at some of the nuanced information in order to predict what the next course of action for that adversary might be. So with that said, we'll actually go through a couple of human stories, if you will, actual human engagements that we did in information security to help support incident response. The first one is Oplcarus. So for those of you not familiar with Oplcarus, Oplcarus is an annual hacktivist campaign that targets the financial sector every year. It's kind of died down since last year, but I think it started around 2013, 2014. And every year these guys would come out, Oplcarus, we're targeting this bank, we're targeting this bank. And they would, take down whatever banks they could, whether it was DDoS, whether it was SQL injection, whether it was cross-site scripting, very high-level attack attempts. It wasn't anything complicated. It wasn't anything like APT attacks. It was just they were open about it. They told the world about it. We're coming. Watch out. So we were on one of these ISAC email distros, and a representative from one of the banks, and I think it was a bank in Europe, came and said, hey, during this period, we saw a huge uptick in SQL injection and cross-site scripting activity. We're not sure what's going on. Is anybody else seeing this? So there was another group of researchers that were on the thread who were familiar with this campaign that was occurring during the same time that this bank came out and said, hey, we saw SQL injection occurring from this day to this day in April of 2017. So because the researchers that were also on the email chain kind of had that background that, hey, hacktivists usually attack banks with SQL injection. And the time frame that you're telling us that you saw the SQL injection attacks and the cross-site scripting attacks kind of overlaps with that campaign date. However, just because we have a date that a bank said, hey, we're seeing these attacks, and we also assess that there's hacktivists that are conducting a campaign during the same time frame, you can't necessarily just put 1 and 1 and get 2. You have to do a little bit more research to confirm, was the SQL injection and cross-site scripting events directly related to the actual hacktivist campaign? So that takes a little bit more research. So we did a little bit more research. I keep saying we, and I'm outing myself right now, but whatever. We did some more research. We found actually a GitHub repo of tools, and it was advertised as Oplcarus. And the tools actually consisted of a lot of Python scripted DOS tools, cross-site scripting tools, SQL injection tools. So now we actually have a potential list of, hey, these are the tools that they're using. It includes SQL injection tools. It includes cross-site scripting tools. Hacktivists are using it. They're saying use it against the banks. We have a bank that's saying, hey, we're seeing cross-site scripting and SQL injection attacks. Now we're starting to collect more evidence, and we can make a more sound assessment that, hey, these might be the work of hacktivists that are participating in Oplcarus. Still not enough information, really. So we went further and we identified a couple individuals that we knew from years past participated in these attacks every single year. We just reached out to them. We just reached out to them on social media or whatever forums and Discord channels, acting as if we were one of them. And we asked them, dude, what's up? What's going on? We built that report in order to understand what exactly they were doing. That's just a screenshot of the GitHub repo. You can see a lot of old Python scripted tools. There's GrrCON, which is extremely old. It's probably not even used anymore. So here's a screenshot of the actual communication that these researchers had with a potential threat actor. And you can see we actually had some leading questions. Are you using SQL injection? Are you targeting banks? And for all of those questions, yeah, I found a vulnerable bank. Did you hit it with SQL injection? Yep. Holy shit, please don't tell me it was select 1 equals 1. Maybe. Rolling on the floor laughing. I mean, he's pretty much admitting, yeah, we're hitting banks with SQL injection attacks. Select 1 equals 1, all that stuff. We took that information back to the bank that was reporting these attacks and told them, hey, here's what we found. Is this what you're seeing? They confirmed, yes, we're seeing a lot of these high-level SQL injection 1 equals 1 crap in our logs. So now we're able to take that information, we're able to take that incident that the bank is reporting and correlate that to qualitative collection. We didn't do any malware analysis, we didn't do any technical, there's no malware report here, there's no technical analysis, it's just straight up qualitative, does A equal B? And that's how we came up with the conclusion that there's a high likelihood or a high probability that these are the threat actors that are attacking you, here's why they're attacking you, and here's the tools that they're using against you. If you're protected against these tools, if you're protected against these tactics that they're using, you're good to go. So the last one I'll present to you is a little bit more interesting. It's a little bit shorter, but this one was a little bit more recent as well. We identified a hacktivist group that was operating out of Iran. There's a whole bunch of them. So we just reached out to one because somehow we found out what their Twitter handle was based off just doing research on these Iranian forums. And we started to build some rapport with them. I don't speak Persian. I speak Urdu, which is spoken in Pakistan and eastern Afghanistan. So on the off chance he wanted to prove where I'm coming from or who I am, I still have that little bit of language. I can kind of prove that, hey, you, me, same. You can talk to me. It's safe. We started talking about other hacktivist groups or other suspected APT groups. Of course, we didn't use APT when talking to this guy, but we just started talking about other groups that security researchers have been talking about for the past few years as, possibly suspected of being supported by the Iranian government. And it's actually easier to start talking about another group because no one self-implicates themselves. When you start talking about another threat actor to one threat actor, they're more willing to come out and talk and implicate the other individual instead of talking about themselves. So what we did was we started talking, we started throwing some names out, we started asking, hey, how does the Iranian government treat hacktivists? Because there's information that there's actually a working relationship in Iran between domestic hackers and the government versus in Russia, it's more coercion, China, it's more patriotic. So we started talking about that, and we threw out some names. We had to censor it because the analysis is still in progress. We've passed it on to more strategic level partners that could actually take this information and do something with it, build their target packages, whatever. But he straight up and came out and said, yes, this particular group works for IRGC. Now, is that information I can do something with based off, what Fidelis does? No, not really. My customers probably don't give a shit that this group works for IRGC. But there are organizations out there that are interested in the strategic level information. And when we confirm that this particular group is indeed sponsored by IRGC, the next time their name comes up in an APT attack or whatever it is, we can go back to this chat and the target package and say, this group is sponsored by IRGC. They have the capabilities and the intent to launch a legitimate attack against your organization if they come after you. So that's an example of qualitative analysis. We didn't touch malware. We didn't write any technical reports. We're just trying to get behind the adversary themselves and be able to predict what they might do in the future and assess that based off their current capabilities and their intent. All right. So the question still remains, how do we visualize and quantify qualitative analysis and something as subjective as, subjective analysis? So currently we do have a lot of references that we use in information security. However, these tend to focus a little bit more on what a piece of malware is doing on an endpoint or over the wire. Stuff like MITRE, we have the Lockheed Martin cyber kill chain, CVSS scores. The Carver score is actually not something that's very popular in information security, but we did use it in the DoD a lot because the Carver score actually measured probability impact of a particular threat actor when we were putting a target package together on him. If he was taken out, what would the impact on the organization be? If he developed or came up with this new tool, what would the impact be? How dangerous is this particular adversary to U.S. forces? So that's where the Carver score kind of was the inspiration to how I wanted to visualize and measure qualitative attributes for adversaries in cybersecurity. So it looks at some of the more nuanced aspects of the adversary. It looks at their social, the social influences, their internal influences, as well as a little bit of their operational influence and their intent. So the two things, before I explain the chart, so the two things that I took strongly into consideration when identifying how do I start measuring an adversary's, qualitative capabilities. And the two things that I came up with was their capability and their intent. Now, capability and intent is even further broken down into more criteria, if you will, and those criteria or dimensions are represented by each of the vertices on the chart. You can have as many criteria as you want. For what I'm experimenting with, we chose 3 and 3, so it forms a hexagon. And what this visualization does, it helps the analyst in the future kind of evaluate and prioritize the threat based off how severe their capabilities and intent is. Additionally, you can take this information, present it to a customer if they're trying to prioritize their threats, and they can look at this chart and be able to prioritize their decisions based off what the analyst recommended, based off the analyst's assessment of a particular adversary's capability and intent. So we have one that's overlapped here. We have Grizzly Step APT29 versus Minion Ghost, which is just a hacktivist group. One of the hacktivist groups that participate in hacktivist operations against banks and critical infrastructure. They're not very well resourced, if you will. They're more of a nuisance. But we overlaid that with something as severe as Grizzly Step, and by overlaying that, we can actually tell immediately that if there's a threat report coming out saying, hey, Minion Ghost is going to target the banks, okay, do we need to worry about them that much? No, their capability and intent is quite low. If we get information that Grizzly Step might be coming after your organization or your industry, yeah, it's a huge freaking deal. We need to address that right away. How do you communicate probability and impact, right? We discussed this earlier. And in the DoD and the intelligence community, there was 2 statements that you produced in order to communicate probability and intent. You had the most dangerous course of action, and then you had the most likely course of action. Both of these statements focus on both probability and impact. However, each focuses on one more than the other. So the most dangerous course of action is pretty much what's the worst case scenario, the nuclear option, right? If this particular threat actor comes after us, what is the worst thing that could happen if we don't address the vulnerability that they might be exploiting, right? And you can create that statement based off past observations, all right? The last 2 times this adversary came after an organization, they set the building on fire. Why? Because they exploited this vulnerability, whatever. So that's the most dangerous course of action. And if you have a good analyst on the team, the most dangerous course of action will definitely raise concern. However, it still stays within reason. Not everything is they're going to set off nukes. It's definitely something that you have to still maintain your credibility for when you're crafting these assessments. And then the most likely course of action is pretty much straightforward. What's the probability? How likely are they to come after your organization? How likely are they to act on their threats that they're propagating on Twitter that we're going to come after the banks? How likely are they to cause damage within your organization? And that's where the MLCOA comes into play. So by applying qualitative analysis and subjective attributes to your overall intel and risk management function, you're just adding that extra layer of analysis that not only helps the analyst prioritize their collection efforts, but now you're helping your customers and your internal stakeholders prioritize the threats and make the best decision going forward based off the analyst's risk assessment. Thank you.